Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us today. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to have you all here. Our panelists have a lot to talk about today, so I'm going to get us started with some quick housekeeping. First is that we are recording this webinar, and the recording will be sent out to everyone that is registered. That recording will also include a copy of the slide deck, as well as a certificate of attendance, and then any other resources that are referenced during the discussion today. And then there also is a Q&A box open to you. Take a moment to find it. We do encourage questions. We encourage comments. If you have any questions throughout the presentation today, send them in and we will flag them and do our best to address as many of them as we can by the end of the webinar. With that, I do have the pleasure to introduce today's moderator and Teachstone's Vice President of Policy and Partnership Development, Amanda Alexander. Amanda brings to Teachstone more than 20 years of progressive leadership experience in public education. Prior to joining us, she held senior leadership roles in the District of Columbia Public Schools, including interim chancellor, deputy chancellor, and the chief of elementary schools, where she provided leadership and vision for the district's elementary schools. And she led a team of principal supervisors, and she also oversaw their early childhood programs. She began her career as a kindergarten teacher and served as an assistant principal in the New York City Department of Education and as a principal in the District of Columbia. She later joined DCPS, their central office, in a variety of roles with an emphasis on principal supervision. And by leveraging a generous grant from the Wallace Foundation, she provided extensive professional learning opportunities for principal supervisors focused on the knowledge and skills necessary to support principals in an era of new rigorous learning standards. And for the pioneering work in the field of principal supervision, DCPS was featured in a documentary and publication of the foundation. Over the course of her time as a central office administrator, Amanda also led literacy initiatives and a district-wide task force to identify and implement evidence-based practices to improve student performance. Her efforts in this area were recognized by the Reading Recovery Council of North America, which rewarded her with the Excellence of Literacy Leadership Award in 2018. Amanda has a bachelor's in English and a master's in education and curriculum and instruction from Howard University. And she also has a master's of science in education in educational leaderships from Baruch College, and she has a PhD in education from American University. Without further ado, Amanda, I will pass the floor to you to introduce the rest of the panel.
Thanks, Gloria, for that lovely introduction. I'm pleased to be joined here today by three people who I really respect. The first is Bridget Hamry. Dr. Hamry is co-founder and chief executive officer at Teachstone. Her research conducted over the last 20 years at the University of Virginia helped document the specific classroom interactions that support children and adolescent development and learning. She has also designed and tested innovative professional learning models proven to change teaching practice and enhance student outcomes. As CEO of Teachstone, a certified B Corp, of which I'm very proud to be a part of, Bridget leads efforts to partner with the field to bring the best of research, policy, and practice together to ensure that every child and every educator has access to life-changing interactions. Welcome, Bridget. We're also joined by Jean Pinkard. Jean serves as the Director of Practice and Leadership at Aspen's Institute Education and Society Program. A longtime educator and leader, he leads the Aspen Education Urban District Networks, supporting superintendents, chief academic officers, and other leaders as they deepen their learning and refine their improvement strategies. Jean was most recently the Chief of School Design and Continuous Improvement at DC Public Schools, where he led the school improvement, innovation, and strategic planning efforts of the district. Previously, Jean focused on equity initiatives and pedagogy in his roles as a principal supervisor for middle schools and as a principal in traditional public and charter schools in Washington, D.C. Jean currently serves as adjunct at the American University Graduate School of Education on the Board of Honored and on the Community Action Board of a Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C. Next is Vladine Barthalis, who works closely with districts in CASEL's Collaborating Districts Initiative to help them with systemic implementation of SEL. Formerly a school counselor, she was successful in developing programmatic solutions to increase student achievement and growth in several high poverty schools. In Washington, D.C., she worked as a student discipline and school climate specialist. She became the district's manager of school climate in 2015 and led the development and implementation of a new school climate initiative, working with 73 district schools and focusing on effective systems, warm and engaging relationships within schools, and explicit SEL opportunities for students. The initiative has been shown to support a decrease in suspensions and an increase in student satisfaction with school. Vladine holds a master's degree in human relationships with a concentration in counseling from the University of Oklahoma and a doctorate in education from the College of William and Mary, where her research focused on the relationship between student infractions and social emotional learning. Vladine, Bridget, and Jean, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us here today for this timely and really relevant conversation. You know, yesterday marked the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, right? And just a week ago, or 1 week prior, was the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd at the hands of law enforcement. And, you know, while our nation has come a long way when it comes to race relations and equity for all, we still have a long way to go. I'm sure you will agree. As leaders and educators, we have a role in all of this. And I believe our charge is to ensure that systems and structures do not perpetuate inequities. We do think a lot about this at Teachstone and what it means for us, as both you do at Aspen and CASEL. And so this conversation on the SEL needs of students and educators, given the twin pandemics, is warranted. So let's begin with a short video clip. I would love to get your reactions afterwards. So Gloria, if you could please play the clip, that would be great.
Amanda, hold on. We have the poll first. Do you want to run that first?
Sure.
Okay. So we're going to run a quick poll just to get an idea of who is in the audience with us. I'll keep this up for about 30 seconds and then we will move on to that video that Amanda mentioned. Here are our results, Amanda.
Great. So we have a nice mix of everyone. I mean, about half of our participants are teachers. We have 34% who are serving as coaches, 1 state leader, 1%, and then we have some program administrators and school leaders. So this is a nice mix, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and comments for the panel. Let's go ahead and begin with that video, Gloria, and ask our panelists to respond.
The driver for learning is the social connection. Activating a child's cognitive skills begins with activating their social connectedness. Children in this school are starting the day with an adult saying to them, I see you, I know you, I'm connecting with you, and you're important to me.
We start each day by greeting every kid at the door. Good morning, Declan. You ready this time? Thank you, baby. Every classroom does some variation of, would you like a high five, handshake, or hug? Essentially, it's what greeting would you like? How you doing, handsome? There is a great deal of cultural sensitivity and empowerment for children to say, here is how I want to greet you. High five, handshake, and hug. You got your hair done? Good morning, Molly. You got your hair done? Let me turn around. I love it. All right, we're gonna have a good day today? All right. High five, handshake, hug. During that time, I'm just trying to connect with them, right, help them from their transition from home to school, and just kind of take a pulse check to see where they are. Oh, I knew you wanted a hug. How are you feeling today, sir? We gonna have a good day? Look at my eyes. Do they look escalated? Do they look triggered? Do they look upset? So it's a way for me to see, okay, who needs to be where? How can I help? How can I be assistance to start their day off most effectively? Good morning, Ariella. How you doing today? I'm being very intentional about my interactions with students, right? So it's not just I'm in the back of the room, hey, come in. No, I'm making a connection with them. I'm have eye contact with them. I'm checking in how they're doing. I'm checking to make sure they're okay. Good morning, friends. Morning. I think the impact is deep relationships. I get to know my students. I get to check in with them. I get to find out something about them. They get to find out something about me. We get to make a connection. And that starts with the greeting at the door. All right, come on in. So a child is walking in the door feeling cared for, empowered, and encouraged. And that teacher is focusing in on who that child is. And that's how the day starts.
Great. Thanks, Gloria. Jean and Vladine, I know you recognized some faces from that video and are probably happy to see Cynthia Rivers Robinson was the principal of that NS. She actually participated in a previous webinar with me here at Teachstone. But I'd love to hear from all three of you what your reactions were to that, what resonated with you. What would you like to lift up for our participants to hear today?
I'll go ahead and jump in. I think it just reminds us that there is no learning outside of a relationship. I mean, we are human beings first, and we know what happens when we try to turn teaching and learning into a transactional process that doesn't involve connection and doesn't involve people being in spaces where they can connect at the heart. And so what that reminds me of is when you create those environments where students feel seen, they feel heard, they feel like they're important, they're more ready to actually engage in the process of learning. So it's just a reminder, of what's most important to kind of set that foundation and create an environment that's rich and right for learning.
Thanks, Vladine. Jean or Bridget?
I'd only add that I love the video because it's how simple practices can make a big difference, right? It's not necessarily implementing a curriculum, although we can talk about that as an important part of SEL, but it's these sort of simple routines that teachers can do such a difference. So I love examples like that. Things teachers could pick up and do tomorrow in their classroom that we know really make a difference for kids.
Yeah, ditto to all that. There were a couple of things that really jumped out at me. One is after a year of embracing my introverted tendencies, that actually made me miss being around people and seeing kids in spaces together. And she used the language of intentionality. I think there's a lot that happens naturally and organically when students are physically in a space together. But as you can see, there was great intentionality and design in the way that she positioned herself, the language that she utilized. And I'm also mindful of how intentional we'll have to be as we continue to experiment with virtual learning opportunities and virtual engagement, that you can't necessarily expect things to just emerge organically. That intentionality will remain important throughout the K-12 spectrum, both in real life and virtual situations.
Thanks, Jean. So I guess I can chime in now. I was really struck by this notion of connections at the door. And I'm thinking about kids coming back to school full time, 5 days a week from the pandemic in the fall. And I guess I would encourage all of the participants who are here with us today to think about how we will receive our students back, at the door in August and September. What are we doing over the summer to connect with them and their families in preparation? Even over the summer, what are administrators and teachers doing for themselves and their own mental health? We just saw tennis champion Naomi Osaka prioritize her own mental health by dropping out of the French Open. So, what can district and state leaders do to help ensure the mental wellness of not only children, but adults who serve them? So, those are the thoughts that are on my mind. And thanks to all of you for sharing your reactions to that clip. Let's now transition to what the research says about teacher-student interactions and social-emotional learning. And Bridget, I'm going to turn to you here. You have spent your professional career in this space. So could you tell us a little bit about what the research says, what you'd like us to walk away knowing today about this?
Sure. Well, I sort of had 3 points I was going to make before I even saw that video clip, and you've primed them perfectly. But actually, before I do, just seeing that we have over half of the attendees today are teachers, I just want to start with a deep sense of gratitude and thanks to each of you for the work that you've done over the past year and a half. As a mother of a 14-year-old and 7-year-old twins, my 14-year-old is sitting in virtual school right next to me right now, and I just know how hard it has been. And you showing up here shows you are a teacher who cares, an educator who cares about social emotional learning. And I just want to recognize how hard you worked to make those connections. It's hard every day, but the pandemic has certainly made it harder. So just deeply appreciative, personally and professionally. So, I think the first, and Bludine said this as well, we know that social emotional learning and academic are not separate. But yet still too often, I think we hear people say we don't have time for social emotional learning. And what I want to say is it's not a choice. Social emotional learning is happening in every single classroom, in every single moment. The question, and Jeannie pointed this out, is one of intentionality. So are educators actually intentionally fostering the social emotional skills, or are children simply walking into classrooms every day trying to figure out and navigate the social environment that they are in? So I think this sort of artificial dichotomy and really the sort of brain science and our sort of physiology demonstrates that at a core sort of physiological level, these things are connected with one another. One of my favorite research studies is a video of a baby. It's called the still face experiment, and you have to be prepared if you haven't seen this before, but it's a very simple infant with her mom sitting and interacting in a very typical way. The baby's probably 8 months old, and then all of a sudden the teacher or the parent simply turns around and then comes back with a very still face and keeps the still face while the baby tries to interact with her. And what it demonstrates is from infancy, our children, all of us, are just primed for these social interactions. And if we don't get the kind of response that we need, it's very upsetting. So you see this baby go from happy and joyful to extremely distraught in a matter of 45 seconds. So I think it's just helpful to think about how that plays out in classrooms every day. So we know these things are connected. The second point really is that they're formed, and we saw this in the video, they are formed through the daily interaction. So yes, social emotional learning curricula can be very helpful to help provide teachers with a scaffold and support for bringing social emotional content into the classroom. But there are opportunities in every single moment of every single day to foster these skills. And then the third point is really that, and Amanda, I think you sort of framed this a little bit, that this is not just about outcomes for our students, but it's about outcomes for our teachers as well. And I know we're going to talk about this, but coming out of this pandemic, we entered the pandemic with a teacher shortage, undercompensated, under-rewarded profession that I'm so thankful that many of you listening have chosen to do. But we know that's exemplified, and we know almost every teacher comes into the profession because they're driven to connect with students. And unfortunately, we don't always create an environment where we let them prioritize that, and we don't provide them with the resources and supports to know, particularly for developing relationships with those children with whom they struggle. There are very specific strategies and skills we can teach teachers to help form those connections with the kids who are they're really struggling with. And when we don't do that, not only do the children and adolescents have a hard time in the classroom, but the teachers get stressed and ultimately often leave the profession. So I think these investments that we're going to talk about today in social emotional learning are just so critical. And I'm excited to hear what our great colleagues are thinking about as we re-enter the sort of real world and how we can use this moment to prioritize these skills that we know are so critical.
Thanks, Bridget. So I have a couple of questions for Jean and Bladine that I'd love for them to respond to, and you as well, Bridget. So the first is really, as we emerge from this global pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and schools reopen in the fall, I'd just love to hear what's on your mind. What are you thinking about right now?
I'll start. Amanda, as you mentioned, we spend a lot of time with system leaders from across the nation, particularly superintendents and members of their cabinet. And what we're hearing from them consistently is that the window of innovation that we all saw opening at the beginning of the pandemic is beginning to close. The opportunity to think differently about what's important for students as we get back to normal. We have to remember that normal wasn't working for a lot of students. And one of the things that we learned during the pandemic was the importance of connection, the importance of relationship, the importance of belonging. And students have seen that, whether in virtual spaces where they've learned new ways to self-regulate, or older students who've opted out of school systems to go into work where they feel a stronger sense of belonging. It's those windows and those opportunities that system leaders feel compelled to seize upon and compelled to give students a richer and more holistic experience. And it's top of mind for them in terms of how we're going to make that happen and not lose the opportunity to do right by students.
The window of innovation closing. Bladine?
Yeah, I'm gonna piggyback off of the comment that Jean just made about the normal that folks are wanting to somewhat rush back to. I know that we are short on time, but I think this quote by Sonia Renee Taylor is just absolutely critical. She says, "We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal, other than we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return, my friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature." And so I really think there's a lot that's top of mind when I think about this pandemic and in schools reopening with almost all students in person. I think about the social, emotional, and mental well-being of students, of families, of caregivers, of all of the adults charged to serve them, of all of the teachers on this call. We have all had an experience, and sometimes in the rush to get back to something that we know wasn't working, we run the risk of acting as though that there's no need that needs to be met socially, emotionally, and mentally. The other thing is that I also think about the idea of forgetting that we're human first, which that video captures so well. Like we have to feel connected to actually open up the space to learn. And so if we forget that we're human, then we also run the risk of teaching and learning happening outside of the aspect of our emotional and internal human connection. So we lose the opportunity to feel secure in our own identity. We lose the opportunity to build thriving relationships. All of those pieces, we lose the opportunity to build a sense of belonging that Jean talked about, or even that space of agency. And then the last piece that I'll talk through is there's a lot of conversation around learning loss. And I think one thing that we have to recognize is all those students were not with us they were still learning. They were still in spaces with family, with community, and learning a lot of different elements that are outside of instruction. And so we have started calling it instructional loss as opposed to learning loss, and making decisions to actually identify what are the assets that were built for our students during this time away from us, and how do we leverage those once they return into learning spaces with us. So those are a few of the spaces, but this is an opportunity that we can capture, and I agree with Jean, like that window is closing, and if we don't capitalize on it, I think we'll lose the opportunity to redefine education in a way that we may never have a chance to do so later on.
Great, thank you both. You know, we alluded to this before, and you did even in your responses, the fact that we have two pandemics going on. We've got, you know, COVID and racial tensions. It's this notion of twin pandemics. You know, how does one approach the work of SEL with equity in mind? And Bridget, you're also free to chime in and speak on what that means, you know, for teaching.
Well, I mean, I'll start. I think, you know, we intentionally sort of talk about this work in terms of every child. And I think one of the things we've been really focused on is making sure that we're thinking carefully about bias and the role that bias plays. So, you know, just speaking of relationships, I was a teacher. I was 21. I was somewhat aware of the biases that I brought into the classroom and the way that that influenced who I responded to well and who I was maybe more tentative with in, you know, and these were first graders. That was never a part of my training. And so I think recognizing that as we talk about relationships, equity really means working with teachers to understand their own biases, that we all have them, that we're bringing into the classroom, and how do we counteract those biases and make sure that every child in our classroom is getting greeted in the way. And I love that from the video too, that doesn't mean it's the same for each of those students. So giving those students the sort of option to tell the teacher how it is that I need you to connect with me, and honoring and respecting their sort of culture, but also that just their identity as a person is so critically important.
Thanks. Ladine or Jean, did you want to speak more specifically to SEL in schools with equity in mind?
Yes, I didn't realize that's muted. Yeah, I'll jump in and say at Castle, we actually have what we call our Equity Insights report. It's on our website, but it really talks about some of the lessons that we have been learning from research and from the work that we're doing with districts that we've partnered with. And there were 5 key insights that came up as we were thinking about social emotional learning, particularly as it works as a lever for equity. The first one is explicitly positioning and communicating about SEL as a lever for equity. I know that if you are reading anything about equity, there's been some conversation around some of the criticisms of social emotional learning and many ways that it could potentially perpetuate some of the marginalization that we see in schools. And that is done when SEL is not implemented accurately. And so one thing that we want folks to understand is when you position social emotional learning as more than a curriculum, as more than a behavior intervention, and you really look at it as a process that adults and students are engaged in together, where the environment is leveraged, where relationships is leveraged, and you really see this as a way to humanize students, to humanize their families and their experiences, then you begin to talk through SEL as more of an equitable leverage tool that you could use in districts. So that's one of the first things. The other thing is really prioritizing adult learning and creating an opportunity to build capacity around social, emotional, cultural development. So all of those pieces, I think being in districts, and I've been in 4, oftentimes we ask teachers, we ask educators to do quite a bit. And we don't create the space for that capacity to be built. We don't create the time for not only the trainings, but for the support, for the opportunities to try, to possibly fail, to get back up, to learn from what you've done and to do it again. And I think these are some of the ways that we really have to start to engage with educators to be able to build that capacity that we know is needed for us to be able to operate and move in this way. The third thing is really elevating students' cultural assets, their voice, their agency, and making that a key factor to how classes are run, schools are run, decisions are made, policies are drafted, practices are actually employed. If we don't center the student, other elements will be centered that cause us to decenter and dehumanize young people. And that is how education has kind of run its course up until this point. Hopefully we can change that. The fourth piece, I got two more. Fourth piece is really partnering with families and developing this culturally responsive approach to SEL. Families and caregivers can really be authentic partners with us in this work, as opposed to the way that sometimes we position them as just consumers of what we're doing in education. So if we can create the space for them to share their own expertise, their own lived experience, what they want to see for their young people, we create a kind of partnership that can really elevate what happens with learning. And then the last part is how we use SEL data and strategies to really inform what we do next. Humanizing even data. We collect a lot of data on young people. They don't know what it is, what we're doing with it. Their families don't know what we're doing with it. So if we can begin to broaden the conversation around data, particularly around SEL, bring families to the table, bring students to the table, help us to understand what the data isn't saying, I think we have more of an opportunity to learn from those data pieces and to make decisions that are best informed to support equity with young people.
Yeah, there's a lot there that I would want to run with, Bladine, and I feel like I think it's good that we spend some time on this question because I think this is the question. It takes me back to the clip, and one of the things the teacher said that she did when she's checking in with the students is to see if they feel escalated or triggered or upset. And I would ask, who among us has not felt that, particularly in the last year, and recognize that students are no exception to that. And if that's the case, and if the responsible districts and the creative districts that we see doing really good work are teaching units about the anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, or our students are watching the news and trying to make sense of what happened on January 6th or what happened in Minneapolis, how are we not going to create space for both the academic rigor of complicated issues and the sophistication that students need to have the introspection and interrelationship between each other? So there's, as Bladine said, there's not only is there no learning without relationship, there's no rigor without relationship, and there's no relationship without rigor. It's the depth of complex material, whether it's struggling through a math problem or talking about complex social experiences, that actually creates the richest opportunity for social emotional development. So there's this false dichotomy about SEL and about rigor, and I guess dichotomy is just two things, but there's also a false separation of the question of equity. You can't discuss these things without a sense of your identity in relation to yourself, your family, your community, and the world. And so if we're not dealing directly with questions of equity while we're having these conversations, we're doing students a disservice. And then the last thing that I would say at this moment, I mean, we could spend the entire hour just talking about this. I noticed that there are a number of program leaders and school leaders in the room, and the role of the school leader in this space is essential. There's significant research around the role of the school leader in driving achievement through their attention to climate. And that climate is about how students experience the school. And again, you can't have that conversation without acknowledging identity and culture and the inequitable realities that we all confront and recognize. Students know these truths. So if we're not helping them to process that, then they see us as inauthentic. And the school leader is the person who can send the signal and authorize the space for people to make time so that teachers know, you know what, if you come in to do an evaluation, I'm actually spending time building a relationship. That's okay. I'm not going to get docked because I wasn't solving a problem at the moment. And so the role of the school leader is something we spent a lot of attention, given a lot of attention to. We have some resources, and I'll see if we can get them in the chat that help school leaders do some of the things Bladine was talking about, taking that data and going a step further to create a community around the data and not just assume that the numbers are the story.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, Bladine, I really appreciated your comment on not forgetting about families and all of this. And I'm reminded, you know, of the fact that education is not an island. You know, it's just not what happens in the school building, but it's really the intersection of so many interests, you know, even beyond family, but community and extended family and the role that they play in all this. So thank you for reminding of us about that when we think about SEL in school. And Jean, again, you were a great principal, so I appreciated you lifting up the role of the principal and not perpetuating, you know, inequity and ensuring that all kids have opportunities to learn.
I had a good boss, Amanda.
You know, Bridget, listening to Jean reminded me of something that I often heard you say. You talk so much about, you know, SEL and interactions not being separate from from instruction and core content, but you know that they are integrated. They're not one and the same. Did you want to add anything more to that?
Well, I mean, I think for me, where it's most striking right now, it goes to the conversation about learning loss, right? So especially, you know, we do the bulk of our work in sort of birth through third grade space. And so all of that, and to go to the point about data, most systems only have data at that point about children's literacy skills. So it's all there's just so much focus around learning loss around literacy. And so, you know, and I think that's important. We want to make sure we are enabling our young children with the skills they need to thrive. But making sure again that that when we think about providing rigorous literacy instruction, that we are thinking about the ways in which we need to form relationships and understand each individual child's needs as we engage with them in that way, and not just think it's about content and delivering them. You know, if we just deliver them with the magic content, they're gonna catch up. So I think how, you know, I'm curious to hear the others think about, you know, where do you see innovation happening, and what are the blockers to that innovation? Because I'm also feeling an urgency, Jean, around like the window is closing, and, you know, excited where I see innovation happening. Our colleagues in Dallas are doing amazing things around sort of changing the structure of school. But I am curious as to, you know, in a moment of urgency, what are the other things we can support educators to do to not lose this as the top of mind?
Great. Thanks, Bridget. Let's turn our attention now to what is actually happening in the field. Jean and Bladine, you guys would know best, given your work with school districts and schools all around the country. Can you tell us a little bit about what you hear in terms, or see in terms of what they're grappling with, some of the struggles, and how they're actually overcoming these challenges, to Bridget's point?
They're struggling with a lot, that's for sure. I think there's the race to get students all caught up. Everyone wants students to recover, you know, from the past year and a half, and to gather everything that maybe they missed the previous year. There's also this focus on there's a needed focus on equity and how do we do that in schools. There's also an elevation of folks understanding that mental health is also a significant area of focus that needs to be dealt with. Social emotional well-being is also another thing that families are asking districts for, and how are you planning on supporting our young people when they return? So I think you have a lot of different elements that were always there, but are more under the microscope at this point. I will even throw out that the ESSER funding, the ARP funds that are now sitting with districts for huge decisions to be made in short periods of time. Well-intentioned, you know, they ask districts to have conversations with families and communities and students around how to use these funds. They want this to be a collaborative process. but then there's a deadline of like 90 days for you to get this whole thing done. Like, it's just not how we operate. So I think school leaders are really trying to figure out, how do I manage all of this and make sure that those that were furthest from opportunity have the most opportunity to succeed, in addition to continuing to move those forward who had all of the advantages and opportunities available to them during this time. So districts are managing this in different ways. I think right now, what we're seeing in our districts is they're all looking at, what is the vision plan for this upcoming school year? There are several districts who have thought about vision plans such as return, recover, reimagine. There's a lot of reimagining happening right now. Like, how do we begin to think about education differently? How do we do work differently? How do we co-design with our families, with our communities? How do we make sure that we're hearing their voices in a way that's more authentic this time around than maybe it has been in the past? There's lots of initiatives that are being shepherded through. Literacy is a significant focus in a lot of districts to ensure that students are able to catch up to some extent on all of those different elements that they have not had access to. What I will say that districts are trying to do, and what we recommend that districts continue to do, is prioritize the priorities. You know, like, it's all important, but you cannot do it all at once. And we know that districts have this issue of initiative fatigue, and every decision that you make at the district office lands in a classroom. And that one individual, that one teacher, has to manage all 10 of the decisions that were made at the district office. So it really is about, how do we create these visions for our districts that actually align with our vision around partnering with young people, partnering with educators, partnering with families in a way that we have not done so in the past. And at the same time, do it with expediency so that we don't lose any more time. So I think those are some of the pieces that districts are struggling with. I will lift up one district in particular. Palm Beach County has done a lot of work around, how do we accelerate learning? They have looked at summer learning in a pretty innovative way. They have been doing work around this for quite some time, and this opportunity here allows them to expand it, where they're able to take young people, before they were taking young people who had been retained 2 and 3 times, and allowing them to be able to recover a year and a half of instruction by really creating accelerated opportunities that fit their own lived experiences. So innovative ideas like that, really allowing young people to be a part of the process. We're also working with other districts who are using a tool like the Co-Pilot Elevate from PERTS that allows them to hear from students how they're experiencing their learning environment. So even as they're putting the push on learning quicker, learning more, they're able to take a step back every 4 to 6 weeks and hear from young people on, how do I feel? How do I know that my teacher cares about me? Am I getting meaningful feedback? Is my teacher actually affirming my identity in this environment? How are they doing in those aspects? And teachers have the opportunity to learn and hear from young people on how are all of their practices landing for the student, him or herself or themselves. So I think there's a lot of pressure. The districts are trying to do things in a different way. I'm hoping that it lands in a way that really feels different for young people as we reopen schools.
Thanks, Libby.
Yeah, that pressure is intensely felt by school leaders, I'm sure, and by system leaders as well. It's interesting that the ESSER funding actually amplifies the pressure, right? You know, well, if you can't get it right now, then maybe it's not even the money, and that's somewhat of a false proposition, in the sense that one superintendent said, if you invest all of these additional dollars, but don't change any of the infrastructure that created the inequitable experiences, you're likely to just replicate or magnify the inequities that are in place. And so leaders, I think, are working hard to think. I'll put it in 3 buckets. And this I'm borrowing from LaTanya Goffney, who's a terrific superintendent in Aldine, Texas. Time, talent, and tier 1 is how she framed it. And these are important buckets in any situation, not just at this moment. The way that I see system leaders thinking about those 3 buckets, The time question is one that Bladine got to around how are we thinking differently about summer school, acceleration opportunities, original credit, recognizing that students have told us that I learn differently, or I need a different time because of my other responsibilities, or this structure, whether they've said it literally and explicitly, or they've shown us through their attendance or their engagement or disengagement, they're sending us a message about what's working and what's not working. On talent, what we see systems doing, including DC, San Antonio, others, is creating space for teachers to learn new content, to recognize that the investment in teacher development is really important now, where teachers need to rejuvenate after the hardest year that any professionals have faced in our lifetime, as well as space for them to connect with each other as professional learning. And the virtual space creates even more opportunities when we saw really smart districts thinking about teacher leadership and teacher planning time within buildings. Now that can go across district. And then the last piece on tiers takes us to the concept of MTSS and thinking about what is the full data set that helps us drive resources and attention to students. Districts creating equity indexes, or indices rather, that allow them to allocate some of the ESSER funding, but even existing resources towards the communities of greatest need. And that need has to be defined by more than just the test scores. And this was highlighted, underscored, and put on Front Street throughout the pandemic. Principals and teachers going out to families just to say, how are you doing? Do you have these fundamental needs of food, security, broadband, in order to be available for learning, and continuing that check-in process throughout the hierarchy of learning needs. And so with all of that in mind, with that data set and with that new relationship that exists, we can't think about time, talent, and tiers without thinking about the dialogue that happens with families and with students that will help us inform these decisions. System leaders are creating space to do that with their adults and do that with their communities, and frankly, sometimes have to contend with a lot of folks that I'll call carpetbaggers, who see the dollar signs that are going to school systems and saying, hey, I can be part of your plan, but they're not actually thinking about what's for the students. They're just thinking about the opportunity. And so system leaders, school leaders are often confronted with holding at bay forces that would draw us away from what we know is right for kids.
Thanks, Jean and Bladine. Let's move on to our next question, which I think we can actually skip, Gloria, because we did hear some examples of best practices from the field from Bladine, and Bochin. But if there are any other strategies that you feel that would be helpful for our audience, I encourage you to incorporate them into your responses to this last question, which is really how can leaders effectively roll out a new SEL initiative? You know, a lot of people, there are some districts in some places that this is new to them, like the pandemic itself kind of got them thinking about it, because the pandemic definitely busted the myth that SEL is only for Black and brown kids. I think everyone realizes that we need to tend to our emotional well-being. But, you know, could you talk a little bit about what you've seen in terms of rollout and what makes it successful? You know, how do people address pushback when they see it and obtain the buy-in that they need for such an initiative?
I'll start off on this one if that's okay. Amanda, one of the things that you brought to us in DC as principals and again as principal supervisors was just the space to learn. I've always appreciated going to work and feeling like I got smarter while I was there, not like I walked in and I had all the answers. And so it's important for principals, I think, in their school communities and for system leaders to share the research, to share what we're learning about the science of learning and development, about developmentally appropriate practice, about the impact of non-academic indicators on long-term success, as a way to help people understand the spaces where we need to learn and grow as professionals, the spaces where in our school, in our community, or in your classroom, you can experiment and we can try to do something differently to increase the engagement that students are feeling, to understand that this isn't an either or proposition, as we've all said many times, that there's actually research, brain-based research, there's outcome research that tells us this is an investment in achievement. This does actually help your test scores, and those test scores aren't the only important thing. So I reserve the right to add more, but I do want to, I'll stop there and say the leaders who create the space to understand that this is a learning endeavor and help facilitate that learning experience are what create the spaces for folks to say, I feel compelled by the story you've told me. And what you're also saying implicitly is that I need to give this a try and it's okay to do that.
Thanks,
I will
Gina.
I would just piggyback on that and say I agree with all of that. And I think not forgetting that so many of our educators had no opportunity to actually learn about strategies to use in the classroom to promote these skills. So your point, Jean, about ongoing learning is just to make the space, we spend all of our time watching classrooms and giving people a language to talk about the kinds of practices that occur in classrooms. And I think finding tools to help build common understanding across the network of schools and teachers across grade levels around what does it really look like to show up every day in the classroom, in the school hallways, in ways that demonstrate social emotional skills, I think is so critical. So just visibility into what the practices actually look like and creating consistency around that vision, I think is one really important piece. Otherwise, it can seem really abstract and theoretical, I think, to so many of our teachers who have so much other things to be paying attention to.
Ladine, did you have any thoughts to add on SEL rollout and what works well? I think you're muted.
I'll say yes, Bladine does. Sure she does.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. I would ditto all of that. I think it's important for districts and schools, school leaders, folks need to understand what SEL is and what it isn't. I think having a shared understanding and some common language that families get to understand, caregivers get to understand, educators understand is really, really critical and important. And Jean, you brought up the idea that everybody, not the idea, but the reality that everyone is an SEL expert now. Everyone has a program, everyone has a curriculum. And if you're in the space of, in the school space, and you're a school leader, you're probably being bombarded by all of those developers and vendors around this is what your students need. But I think you have to get really clear on what is the vision that we have for our implementation of social emotional learning. Why is this something that we want to do? And so really having a sense of what is this thing called social emotional learning? It's not solely a curriculum. It's not solely something that can support behaviors, although it has been shown to do that. I think folks really have to understand this is a process that adults and students engage in together. It's a resource, an approach that allows us to change the way that we do school, to change the way that we do teaching. It changes the environment. It focuses on the climate. It's the explicit instruction, but there's also the pedagogy. It's how we actually instruct. All of those pieces is part of social emotional learning. So I think if leaders really want to roll this out effectively, create the vision, and create the vision with collaboration. Sometimes we get into this issue of buy-in because folks were not included when we were talking about it at the beginning. We didn't include the educators that are going to have to implement. We didn't include students to find out what is it that you want to experience when you come into this classroom? How do you want to feel when you see your teacher in the morning? If we start asking questions like this in the beginning, then what we create is going to be something that everyone buys into because they help develop it. So I would say that's one piece. The other piece is create space for the initiative. You already have 10 initiatives. You can't put SEL on top of it. Like, how do we figure out ways for educators to see how these are integrated? If all 10 have to stay, then we have to create a map, some type of visual map for folks to understand this is how SEL actually supports the 10 that's already on your plate. This is how I'm going to help you find time and space in your schedule to do this thing. This is how I'm going to support you, the adult SEL piece, to actually implement this. And this is how we're going to support our young people to build the skills, to build the capacity, to have the agency to speak, to co-construct lessons with you in the classroom, the student SEL piece. And then the final piece is, this is how we're going to learn from all of it. We're not just going to implement and walk away. We're going to implement, observe, learn, reflect, change a few things, observe, learn, reflect. Like, we're going to keep learning about this until we get it right. And so I think that's a different way to roll out an initiative. It's not something that's dumped on a teacher, but it's something that's co-constructed, and it's something that's created with a space for us to continue to learn and grow together.
And if I could add, I think the last thing that really good leaders do when it comes to rolling out an SEL initiative is to model it. You know, we must be reminded that leaders are signal senders, right? We've heard that message plenty of times. And so, you know, how you show up as a leader at a staff meeting, how that meeting is structured that somehow incorporates components of SEL, you know, is a wonderful way to have teachers and staff members live it and experience it with you leading it. So modeling it and leading it is also, I think, a way that leaders can effectively roll out an initiative.
Amanda?
Yes.
Just to add really quickly, I know there's a number of leaders and teachers on here. The folks on this screen work with systems who've invested in this already by virtue of connecting with our organizations. I'm sure there are folks who may feel like they're on an island on this and just want to name that the organizations here there are tools for this, right? So I think we've spoken generally about what it looks like. I can share a couple of things in the chat, but every one of our organizations has toolkits, playbooks, templates that leaders can utilize to institute some of this on their own if they don't have it in the system or in their community.
Thanks for adding that. We are at time, but I want to thank you again, Vladine, Jean, and Bridget, for this very rich and timely conversation. I'm sure it was of value to our participants. I'm going to turn it over now to Gloria to just close us out with a few notes from Teachstone.
Yes, this was indeed a very rich discussion, and we're almost over time. We won't have time for questions, unfortunately. I apologize for that. But a lot of good questions and comments came in. So thank you for engaging with us. I also want to thank our panelists, Amanda, Bridget, Jean, and Vladine. We appreciate your time with us today. Before we part ways, I do want to make the point to our listeners today that Teachstone is here to help your program. We're here to help you drive equity and quality through interactions. And as your partner in this work, we can help you to build warm classroom environments and support that social and emotional development that we discussed today. We can help you build a quality workforce and build capacity. And we can also help you promote positive child outcomes, all through a focus on quality interactions in every classroom. So if you want to learn more, you can do so by visiting us at teachstone.com. But that is all the time that we have today. I will wrap us up. And just as a reminder, you will receive the recording of this webinar and other resources within 24 hours. Thank you. Thank you for our panelists for joining us today, and you all take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.